The House on Fernville Road, Part 1. The Confession That Shocked Manchester. April 16, 1996. A cold, gray morning settled over Manchester, England. The kind of morning where commuters hurried past one another without eye contact, where buses hissed through wet streets, where nothing seemed unusual. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors of Gorton Police Station opened quietly. A middle-aged man walked inside. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look emotional. He didn't look afraid. His clothes were neat. His hands were clean. His expression was calm, disturbingly calm. The desk sergeant looked up casually, expecting perhaps a report about a stolen car or neighborhood dispute. Instead, the man spoke words that instantly changed everything. "I've killed her." The room froze. The officer stared at him, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The man continued in a flat, emotionless tone. "She's upstairs in the bath. I think I've killed her." No tears, no shaking voice, no urgency, just cold acceptance. The man identified himself as 48-year-old James Patterson Smith. Within moments, police units were dispatched to his address on Fernville Road in Gorton, a quiet residential street lined with ordinary semi-detached homes. The kind of neighborhood where children played outside, where neighbors nodded politely over garden fences, where nothing evil was supposed to happen. But behind one ordinary front door, investigators were about to discover one of the most horrifying crime scenes in British history. As officers approached the house, nothing immediately stood out. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no screaming, no chaos, just silence. The front door opened, and the moment officers stepped inside, the nightmare began. Blood. There was blood everywhere, not just a small stain or isolated splatter. Blood smeared across walls, blood on the floors, blood on the ceilings, blood in nearly every room of the house. Veteran officers who spent years investigating violent crimes stopped in disbelief. One detective later admitted the scene haunted him for the rest of his life. Following the trail upstairs, officers entered a bedroom where they discovered the body of 17-year-old Kellyanne Bates. What they saw was so horrifying, so unimaginably brutal, that even hardened detectives struggled to process it. This was not an accident. This was torture, systematic torture, carried out over weeks. And the man responsible had calmly walked into a police station to confess, as though he were discussing the weather. Before we continue, a warning. This case contains descriptions of extreme violence, abuse, and torture that many viewers may find deeply disturbing. But at the center of this story is a real young woman whose life mattered. A girl with dreams, a family, a future. Her name was Kellyanne Bates. And what happened to her would expose one of the most disturbing domestic abuse cases the United Kingdom had ever seen. The girl everyone loved. Long before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the horror inside that house on Fernville Road. Kellyanne Bates was just a normal teenage girl growing up in Greater Manchester. She was born on May 18, 1978, in Hattersley, a working-class community built to house families relocated from Manchester's overcrowded inner-city districts. The neighborhood wasn't wealthy. Rows of brick homes stretched along narrow streets. Families worked hard. Money was tight, but communities were close-knit. Neighbors knew each other. Children played outside until sunset. And in that environment, Kellyanne stood out immediately. Friends describe her as warm, energetic, and incredibly kind-hearted. She had an infectious laugh that filled rooms. Teachers remembered her as thoughtful and intelligent, the kind of student who actually listened, who cared about people, who made others feel included. One former teacher later said, "Kelly was the type of student who reminded you why teaching mattered." At school, she excelled academically and athletically. She loved running track and quickly became known for her speed and determination. But beyond sports, Kellyanne had bigger dreams. She wanted to become a teacher. She imagined a future helping children, building a stable life, traveling someday, maybe even starting a family of her own. Like most teenagers in the 1990s, she loved music, hanging out with friends, and spending weekends at local cafes and shopping areas. She wrote poetry, kept journals, talked endlessly about the future, and, perhaps most importantly, she was extremely close to her mother, Margaret Bates. The two shared a bond built on trust, laughter, and honesty. Margaret later described Kellyanne as her best friend. She was just finding herself, Margaret said years later through tears. She had dreams, plans, her whole life ahead of her. No one who knew Kellyanne could have imagined the darkness waiting for her, because somewhere else in Manchester, a predator was already watching. A man who had spent decades hiding his true nature behind a carefully constructed mask. A man named James Patterson Smith. The monster behind the mask. James Patterson Smith didn't look like a monster. That's what made him so dangerous. To neighbors, he appeared ordinary, respectable, even. His home on Fernville Road was spotless. He kept himself well groomed. He didn't drink heavily. He didn't smoke. He wasn't known for public outbursts or drunken violence. People described him as quiet, maybe a little strange, but harmless. But behind closed doors existed an entirely different man, a deeply controlling, violent predator obsessed with domination. By the time he met Kellyanne, Smith was already in his mid-40s and had a disturbing history of abusing women. Years earlier, his marriage had collapsed because of escalating violence and psychological abuse. His ex-wife later described him as intensely possessive, the kind of man who needed total control over every aspect of a partner's life. After the divorce, the abuse continued with other women. One former girlfriend, Tina Watson, later testified that Smith gradually transformed from charming to terrifying. At first, the violence came in small bursts, a slap, a shove, a punch disguised as anger. But eventually the abuse became daily torture. He used me like a punch bag, she later recalled. Smith beat her while she was pregnant. He hit her with objects, kicked her, humiliated her. And then came a chilling detail investigators would later recognize as a horrifying warning sign. At one point, Smith allegedly tried to drown her in the bathtub. Years later, another teenage girlfriend revealed Smith had held her head underwater in a sink during arguments. These weren't random explosions of rage. They were acts of domination, control, fear. Psychiatrists later suggested Smith suffered from severe paranoid jealousy and lived within a distorted psychological reality where women became possessions rather than human beings. But despite all this, he continued slipping through society unnoticed. No one truly saw the monster behind the mask. And in 1993, he found his next victim, a 14-year-old girl named Kellyanne Bates. The grooming begins. Kellyanne was just 14 years old when she met James Patterson Smith. He was 45. Their first interaction seemed harmless. Kellyanne had been babysitting for one of Smith's acquaintances. Afterward, Smith offered to walk her home. To outsiders, it looked protective, friendly, safe, but predators rarely appeared dangerous in the beginning. Smith understood exactly how to manipulate vulnerable young girls. He positioned himself as caring and mature, someone who understood Kellyanne better than other people did. He listened to her problems, gave advice, made her feel special. For a teenager navigating insecurity and independence, the attention likely felt flattering. But what Kellyanne didn't realize was that she was being groomed. Slowly, carefully, methodically, Smith isolated her emotionally from the people who truly loved her. He became the center of her world. Kellyanne kept the relationship secret from her parents for nearly 2 years. Deep down, she knew they would never prove. When she mentioned him at all, she lied about his age. She called him Dave instead of Jim and claimed he was only in his 30s. But eventually the truth surfaced. One day, Margaret Bates came home and discovered Kellyanne waiting in the kitchen. Moments later, footsteps echoed from upstairs. Then James Patterson Smith walked down the stairs. Margaret later said the moment terrified her instantly. He swaggered into the room, she recalled, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Then she described something even more chilling. As Smith stood there speaking casually in her kitchen, Margaret suddenly had a violent urge to stab him with a bread knife sitting nearby. Years later, she still couldn't explain it. "I've never had thoughts like that before," she said. "Now I wonder if it was some sort of instinct, a mother's intuition, a warning, one that tragically proved correct. Isolation, After meeting Smith, Margaret desperately tried convincing Kellyanne to end the relationship, but by then, Smith's control was already tightening. This is how abusive relationships often begin, not with violence, with emotional dependence. Kellyanne slowly started changing. Friends noticed she became quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped attending social gatherings, stopped spending time with people she once loved. Excuses became constant. She's busy. She's tired. She can't come. Then the bruises appeared. Bruises on her arms. Bruises on her face. Black eye she explained away with excuses. She fell. She walked into a door. Some girls attacked me. Her parents knew something was wrong. But like many families facing coercive control, they felt powerless. In November 1995, shortly after turning 17, Kellyanne moved into Smith's home on Fernville Road. That decision would seal her fate. At first, communication with her family became limited. Then it nearly stopped entirely. She quit her part-time job, cut herself off financially and socially from the outside world. She missed family Christmas celebrations for the first time ever. Phone calls became strange and uncomfortable. Margaret later said Kellyanne sounded nervous, hesitant, as though someone was listening beside her. Then came the birthday cards. In March 1996, Kellyanne's parents received cards signed supposedly by their daughter. But Margaret immediately noticed something horrifying. The handwriting wasn't Kellyanne's. James Patterson Smith had signed them himself. Margaret begged her husband Tommy to go check on their daughter. She feared the worst. "I thought maybe he had tied her up," she later said, "or hurt her so badly she couldn't write." But under UK law, Kellyanne was legally old enough to live where she chose. Without proof of abuse, authorities had little power to intervene. And behind the walls of Smith's house, the unimaginable had already begun. 4 weeks of hell. By March 1996, Kellyanne Bates had effectively disappeared. No visits, no phone calls, no confirmed sightings. Inside the house on Fernville Road, she was no longer a girlfriend. She was a prisoner. Over approximately 4 weeks, James Patterson Smith subjected Kellyanne to one of the most prolonged and horrifying torture campaigns ever documented in Britain. The abuse was systematic, calculated, deliberate. Investigators later determined Smith frequently restrained her using ropes, cords, and ligatures. Sometimes he tied her to furniture. At other times, he tethered her by the neck like an animal. He starved her. Kellyanne lost nearly 20 kilograms, over 40 pounds. She was severely dehydrated, weak, exhausted, barely capable of resistance. But the physical injuries were only part of the horror. Smith created an environment of absolute psychological terror, isolation, unpredictability, fear, control. Every second of Kellyanne's existence depended entirely on the moods of a violent sadist. The injuries found on her body were in different stages of healing, proving the abuse happened repeatedly over time. Not one outburst, not one argument. Weeks of torture. And among the most horrifying discoveries investigators made was evidence that Smith had gouged out Kellyanne's eyes days before her death, which meant for part of her final days alive. Kellyanne endured unimaginable torture while completely blind, terrified, helpless, alone. The sheer cruelty shocked even veteran pathologists. Prosecutor Peter Openshaw later told the court it was as if he deliberately disfigured her, causing the utmost pain, distress, and degradation. Yet somehow, no one outside the house truly understood what was happening. Neighbors walked past every day unaware. Children played outside. Cars drove by. Life continued normally. While inside one ordinary suburban home, a teenage girl was enduring hell. The investigation. When investigators processed a crime scene, the full scale of the horror became undeniable. Detective Sergeant Joseph Monahan later admitted he had never seen anything remotely comparable in his career. Veteran officers struggled emotionally after entering the house. Some required counseling. Then came the autopsy. Home office pathologist Dr. William Lawler documented more than 150 separate injuries on Kellyanne's body. He had examined roughly 600 murder victims during his career. But this case stunned even him. "I have never seen injuries so extensive," he testified. The official cause of death was drowning, but immediately before being submerged in a bathtub, Kellyanne had been beaten repeatedly with showerhead. It was one final act of violence before death. The evidence completely destroyed Smith's story about an accidental drowning. This was murder. Calculated, prolonged, sadistic murder. And now prosecutors face a challenge of presenting one of Britain's most disturbing criminal cases before a jury. The trial of James Patterson Smith. James Patterson Smith's murder trial began in November 1997 at Manchester Crown Court. From the very beginning, his behavior disturbed everyone inside the courtroom. Despite overwhelming forensic evidence, Smith insisted he was innocent. He portrayed himself as a victim. "She wound me up," he claimed coldly. He even suggested many of Kellyanne's injuries were self-inflicted. Then came one of the most chilling moments of the trial. When asked about Kellyanne's eyes being gouged out, Smith claimed she had dared him to do it. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Psychiatrists testified Smith suffered from severe paranoid disorders and morbid jealousy. But mental illness did not excuse what he had done. The evidence was overwhelming. Jurors viewed horrifying photographs documenting Kellyanne's injuries. Many struggled emotionally throughout proceedings. When deliberations finally began, the jury needed only 1 hour to return a verdict. Guilty. On November 19, 1997, James Patterson Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge described the case as a catalog of depravity by one human being upon another. He called Smith a highly dangerous predator and vowed he would never harm another woman again. In an unprecedented move, professional counseling was offered to every member of the jury because of the psychological trauma caused by the evidence they had witnessed. Every juror accepted. That alone reveals the sheer horror of this case. Kellyanne's legacy. Kellyanne Bates should have lived a long life. She should have become a teacher. She should have traveled, laughed, grown older, and built the future she dreamed about. Instead, her life became a warning to the world about coercive control, grooming, and domestic violence. After her daughter's murder, Margaret Bates transformed her grief into advocacy. She worked with domestic abuse organizations, educating families about warning signs that often appear long before violence becomes deadly. The age gap, isolation, control, bruises explained away, withdrawal from friends and work. Today, many of those warning signs are widely taught because of cases like Kellyanne's. Her story forced authorities to better recognize how abusers isolate victims, even in crowded communities where neighbors live only feet away. Perhaps the most terrifying part of this case is how ordinary everything looked from the outside. An average house, an average street, an ordinary man. Evil rarely announces itself openly. Sometimes it hides behind politeness, behind calm voices, behind clean homes and friendly smiles. And by the time the truth becomes visible, it's already too late. Kellyanne Bates was not defined by the brutality of her death. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, a young woman who mattered deeply to those who loved her. And though James Patterson Smith tried to erase her humanity through unimaginable cruelty, he failed, because decades later, the world still remembers Kellyanne Bates, and it remembers exactly what was done to her behind the walls of that house on Fernville Road.